in about AD 60. And when he went to Laodicea, he preached the gospel, and there was started the Church of Christ of Laodicea. It's kind of an interesting thing how this all weaves together as they who were obedient to the gospel spread the gospel through all the world. But Laodicea has an interesting history. It is the one major premise by which we date the writing of the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation has by many times and many people been said to have been written around AD 96. It was supposed to, by some of those who have studied, been written by John the Apostle. He was the scribe. And he was to have written it on the Isle of Patmos. I used to be told this as a young preacher, and I tried to figure out how John got the letter back to Ephesus or to Jerusalem or to where it was supposed to be held by the church when he was supposedly died at the Isle of Patmos. We found out that Patmos was a condition. It was a situation that was described as an allegory and not the place. Although physically, John the Apostle was marooned to the Isle of Patmos 2 times during his life. So on the Isle of Patmos, this letter was to be written. Now, the thing is, John would be the only apostle that would still be alive in AD 96. The problem, you say, has to do with that, and the book and the city of Laodicea was fairly interesting. In BC 17, which would be corresponding to about or CE 17, which would correspond to something like BC 130. And in CE 38, Laodicea was given to great earthquakes. And in these earthquakes, the town was pretty well messed up. But in AD 85, not CE, but in AD 85, about 15 years after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Roman soldiers, Laodicea had an earthquake that destroyed it. In fact, it was so bad that the Church of Christ at Laodicea went to Hierapolis, which was about 17 miles south, and worshiped with the church there at Laodicea. Now, for all practical purposes, since the town was destroyed, it would have been thought that that would have been the last of the history of the Church of Christ in Laodicea, but that's not so. They rebuilt it. And when they rebuilt it, the Church of Christ came back to Laodicea. I was looking in on the internet tonight, and I found a picture of the church building, the ruins of which, that were still standing in the city of Laodicea. This building was built around 400 A.D. Now, it was a galley congregational building. That is, it had walls on both sides of the building. But the beautiful part about this is that the church building was 1 city block long. Now, if you think of the place of a city block, you're looking at something around 600 to 700, what we'd call feet long. That's a pretty good sized building. And it was a 2-story building, from what they can tell from the height of the columns that exist there. But what was interesting, and I showed my wife, I said, I want you to come here and look. I want to show you something. In the middle of the building of this length, there was a structure. Some people would take it as an altar. This was something that was there that was cast in stone and made as a part of the foundation. It had 2 levels, a lower and a higher level. And as far as can be ascertained and determined, that was the table of the Lord, on which the Lord's Supper was served. by the Church of Christ at Laodicea. What means too much might mean too little, but the fact is they had become faithful in that extent. Laodicea was a rich town. A lot of commerce that had gone through there. These brethren were wealthy, and they had a great deal of wealth in that area. But when the Roman kings, being in power, looked to that area of Turkey, they looked to Laodicea as the place to engender a lot of wealth. They had caused a lot of Jews after the fall of Jerusalem to come to the Laodicean, Hierapolis, Ephesian, or Ephesus area. And these people that had come there, by the time that the church was in existence at about AD 62 or 3, right before the fall of Jerusalem, had quite a populous or numerous amount of Jews. The gospel had been preached, the Church of Christ was started, and by the time of the year of the great destruction of the earthquake in AD 85, there was supposed to be about 20 congregations of the Churches of Christ in this town. So you can see that the Church of Christ in Laodicea was a strong, populated work with great numbers who attended the assemblies. And as you understand this, you then can tell that if it was destroyed in AD 85, and the book of Revelation writes to the church at Laodicea, it couldn't have been written in AD 96. It had to have a previous writing date, because the church at Laodicea didn't exist after AD 85 until about the turn of the century. When it did and was rebuilt, of course, it gained strength and came back to its populated numbers. But before then, it wasn't there. Now, the reason they brought all the Jews, as far as we can determine, from Jerusalem up to Laodicea in that area was because of the wealth of the area and the number of people that could work and be involved in the technical aspects of the casting and the dyes and all that they were famous for, and for which a lot of money had been made. And so the Roman government brought them. When the church got there, in the reign of Domitian, who was the cruelest Roman Caesar that is on record, there were a lot of members of the Church of Christ who had to give their life. Now, when we studied about Pergamos and when we studied about Sardis, the Lord told these congregations in Revelation that they would go through a great scourge and a great trial of affliction. Laodicea existed at that time. The difference is these congregations remained faithful to the cause of Christ. Laodicea threw in the towel. They decided they'd rather get along and exist than exist in punishment and in torture and in pain. Because of this, the Church of Christ at Laodicea had a compromising attitude about things that the other congregations did not have. You want to bring in Judaism? We'll bring in a little Judaism. You want to bring in a little paganism? We'll bring in a little paganism. We are the church that gets along. And because of their attitude, Jesus called them lukewarm. They wouldn't stand for anything. And because they wouldn't stand for anything, Jesus said, I'll come and take from you the gospel of Jesus Christ at this time. So by the very fact that these numbers are important, and the very fact that about AD 80 or AD 85, there's the great earthquake, and Laodicea ceased. 17 miles down the road from Laodicea was Hierapolis. Hierapolis was a town which was named that as a holy city. That's what Hierapolis means, a city of holiness. And the Church of Christ went to, at Laodicea, went to Hierapolis. And in AD 96, as far as we can determine, Laodicea had not been rebuilt, so there was no congregation there. Anybody that wants to talk to you about the dating of the writing of the book of Revelation then shouldn't talk to you about AD 96. If they wait till AD 96, they've waited too late, because Laodicea itself did not exist. So when the gospel is preached, there are internal proofs and aspects of it that will not allow the message of the truth to have no importance or credence as far as a lot of things that we look at, because the date of the writing would be one thing that would be involved. And of all the important things that you could think about in the church at Laodicea, although a lot of people never even consider that, was the time of its existence while the gospel of Christ could be preached. AD 96 would not work. It will work in the writing of the book of Revelation in around AD 68 to AD 70. And a little bit before, when the Apostle Paul was the angel or the messenger who gave the message to the Apostle John, and John wrote it down, and it concerned the congregations that existed in that place and that time. Now, what have we learned? Well, this city was started by a disciple whose name was Philip. All who would think that Philip was a great soldier of the cause of Christ would be satisfied to leave him alone with the eunuch. Because when Philip preached the gospel to the eunuch, history records that the eunuch went back down to Ethiopia, preached the gospel, started the Church of Christ there, and by the time around 300 AD, there were something like 100 to 200 congregations of the churches of Christ that existed in the area of Ethiopia. It is recorded that the congregations got extremely large and numerical. And you would think that this would be a great blessing, that this man, as he left this life, would be having something that he could count on. But that wasn't the end of Philip's work. Because after Philip preached in Azotus and he preached at the cities as he went along, one of the cities that he traveled amongst and went along preaching and teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ was a period of time when Laodicea actually existed. It would be a period of time around AD 60 to AD 68. And Philip went into Laodicea, preached the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the Church of Christ at Laodicea came into existence. Now, the church at Laodicea was not started by Paul. For most people think if it wasn't started by an apostle, it wouldn't be something official. It was started by a disciple of Christ. It was started by a man who loved the Lord, who would go along and preach the gospel to whoever would listen. Philip, as far as we know, with no other record other than history that we have to account, was a man who started congregations that were so large in number that according to the area of which Laodicea was a part of, this became known as the Eastern Church of Christ area, of which they claimed to have 100 million members. Because from here it went into China and the areas where the gospel of Christ was greatly numerically blessed. So you see how interesting it is when you study history to see how these things came about, who the instruments were that God used, and how that when he used these instruments there was a great effect. But it also gives us a means of determining when the books of some of the Bible books were written, and straightens out the fact of AD 96, as opposed to the date of actually when the Church of Christ at Laodicea still existed and was still there. Now, like I told you, it came back in the middle of the first century, 120 to 150 AD, and by the time of the AD 400 era, it was large enough that there was a building built there by the Lord's church that was a city block long. Some of these things you never hear when you talk about the church. The numerical increase of the churches of Christ in the first 2 centuries is unbelievable. Jesus actually did send his disciples into all the world to preach the gospel to every creature. And as they went, their preaching and teaching was instrumental in causing millions of people to be obedient to the gospel of Christ and be added to the Lord's church by the commandment of the Scriptures. These people continued faithful to obedience and in the gospel of Christ, and some stayed many hundreds of years in existence. They tell us today that there is some remnant of the Church of Christ in the town, which it's been renamed, in the town that we know of, Laodicea, today. That it's not very strong and it's not faithful, but it still exists and traces its ancestry back to around AD 60 to AD 68, when the disciple by the name of Philip came through and preached the gospel. Now it kind of gives you a background. So now when you go back and you read about the Church of Christ at Laodicea, you'll know what you're reading about. You'll know who you were reading about. It didn't seem that they had the problem with Gnosticism that we found out in the other congregations, the congregation of Philadelphia, the congregation of Sardis, and in Thyatira, but they did have a problem with lethargy. They just wouldn't continue to push on in preaching the gospel. And when it came to trials and tribulations, they were rather more interested in peace at any price than the price that peace with God would cost them. And so Jesus called them the church that he would spew, or we think of it as spitting, out of his mouth. Why? Because it had such a bad taste that he wouldn't keep it in his mouth. So this is the congregation that is written to. As the Apostle Paul was the means or the angel, these letters were written personally by Christ to his congregations that were his. So I'll read it quickly and then we'll close. And unto the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, these things saith the Amen. Now you know who the Amen is. Jesus says, I'm the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. One of that, the Alpha is the beginning and the Omega is the end. The Amen was the name, the titular title of the name of God of the ancient world. We've already discussed and already understood that the name of Pharaoh, while Moses was on the earth at about 15 to 1600 years before this time, was Amenhotep. It's the word Amen-hotep, or this is the Pharaoh whose name is Amen, which means he's God. So here we go. This is the Amen, the faithful and the true witness, and the originator of all that God created, or as it is translated in the King James, the beginning of the creation of God. If you ever run into Jehovah's Witnesses, they'll tell you that Jesus Christ is a created being. What the Spirit is having John through Paul write is that that's not true. Jesus is the first cause. He's the reason, he's the origin, he's the originator of the creation of God. Now, the creation of God is not the world creation, although Christ was the creator. And that's what the kids were quoting tonight. In the beginning was the Word, words with God, Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. This creation of God that is mentioned here is the Church of Christ. Now, you never read this and you'll find some denominational church mentioned. This is the Lord's church. Because as is true concerning the destruction that the earthquake wrought on Laodicea, that is, that Laodicea didn't exist, so it is true that as you read and study the Scriptures, you don't find the name of a denominational congregation or body of people like Baptist or Methodist or Presbyterian or Roman Catholic. The reason is they didn't exist then. None of these peoples came into existence for another 300 at the best until another 1,500 years after the writings of these books. But here, the creation of God did exist. And the creation of God is the Church of Christ. So Jesus said, I know thy works, that thou art neither hot nor cold, cold nor hot. I would that thou wert cold or hot, so that because thou art lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I'll spew you or I'll spit you out of my mouth. You disgust me. You leave me a bad taste in my mouth. You will not stand for the truth. Because thou sayest, I am rich, and they had a lot of money, and increased with goods, and have need of nothing, knowest not that thou art wretched, and miserable, and poor, and blind, and naked. One is a physical identification of being rich with the wealth of the world. The other is a spiritual qualification. And he said, you think you got money, you think you got gold, you think you got all of this stuff, but you're really wretched and blind and miserable. So he says, I counsel you, or I give you a little advice. Change your way of doing business. Buy of me gold tried in the fire. Of course, gold was a great influence on importance, because this gold was something that was worth a lot of money. So he says, I buy of me something that's worth a lot to you, which is the gospel of Christ, not a dollar bill. So we'll start here again next week, and we'll conclude with the church at Laodicea. And as we continue or end with the Church of Laodicea, for you that have been here for all of these 7 congregations, you will have seen that we went through the 7 churches that the revelated letter was written to, and the problems that they had, and how we don't want to have the same problems that they had. And in so doing, we don't want to come up with the same conclusion that God had of them that he has of us. Number 261. If you will stand, and Austin's here. I didn't know whether he left with them or what. But will you stand?